So here's the history of evolutionary thought. Now, I'm sure there were, before the Greeks, there were other ideas about the natural world and how it got here and all that. So there's all kinds of creation stories and all that, right? But we'll start with the Greeks. Plato came up first with this idea that there's kind of like two planes, the ones that we live on, Earth, matter, all that. But that's actually only a poor facsimile of what is actually going on in terms of creation and what, let's say, well, he didn't believe in God, he believed in gods, but that the creation was kind of like where the gods were, and the allegory of the cave. Does anybody know about Plato's allegory of the cave? What is it?
So he goes into a cave, and I think he sees like the metaphysics and like the people and how they act, and like how shadow or like how it plays out.
Shadows, right. So he viewed it as up where the gods were was where it was actually real, and that this plane that we're on down here is actually only shadows or an imperfect representation of what the real universe looks like. And that in the real world where the gods are, each thing that is was perfect. It was perfection. Whether it was a lion, it was a plant, it was anything that you see in the universe, that was perfection. But down here, imperfect. And then, a little bit earlier, or later, in other words, closer to our time, Aristotle came up with this great chain of being. And you can kind of see this great chain of being right here. Let's see, we can probably, oh yeah, good, okay. So what do we have? Okay. Let's see. Okay, so down here was, it doesn't really show it, but let's say down here, plants. Now that's plants. I don't know what that was. Humans. And then up here was, at the very top, was kind of God. So here we had the ladder. Okay, so stone, flame, plant, beast, there we go. Human, we're pretty close. The heavens, angels, God, and then of course at the very top of the ladder of the great chain of being is Professor Beck. Right? Okay, so I want to make sure you understand the hierarchy here. Okay. It's important to understand. Okay. So, and then in terms of, Judeo-Christian thinking, there was this one God and who created everything, and some of you might have read the creation stories in the Bible. There's two of them. One about God rested on the seventh day, and then the other about God created man, and then created woman out of the rib of man to keep man company. Unfortunately, she led him astray, all that kind of stuff, right? But in terms of adaptation, in other words, all these exquisite things that we see, our fingers and how they're able to grip things, our eyes so we can actually see things. These would help us live, and they help other animals and plants live, depending on what the traits are. And that was seen as an example of God's benevolence. So God's a cool guy. God made everything so that these things were perfectly adapted to their world. And then Carol Linnaeus, who believed in this kind of idea, but who's the first to actually group things or classify things? I think it was the 18th century. But then, in the late 18th and early 19th century, there are some other people that came along. This Georges Cuvier, who was French, people were starting to find fossils, which was strange because according to the Judeo-Christian thing, God created everything, and why would there be things that were dead now when everything was perfect? So, and Cuvier, in fact, lived around Paris, and there's this great kind of basin that used to be seafloor that was uplifted, and now you can find all sorts of fossils in there. And now he didn't believe in God. He was kind of a deist or an agnostic. And he came up with some reasons about why you saw all this stuff, and he came up with the idea of, let's say, a flood that took all this seafloor stuff and deposited it on the land. And there was this idea that things changed through what's called catastrophism. And then Lamarck came up with this idea. He was the first to articulate a theory of evolution, that organisms change over time. That's all it is. He believed, first of all, in terms of where things got here, it was spontaneous generation. Poof! There's a little elephant right here, right? Poof! There's a unicorn. Well, we don't have any more unicorns, so it doesn't matter. And he also believed, this is the best part, I think Lamarckian evolution is the best myself, that if you acquired a certain characteristic, like let's say I pick up a dumbbell and I'm pumping away, pump, 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 my muscles get big, I get to be huge. Instead of being 130 pounds, I'm 250, just like this, right? And that, because of this is an acquired characteristic, I can pass that on to my offspring. And so, whoop, there's little Mo walking around, but he's like this. Instead of being the regular, like, chubby little baby or whatever. Okay? So, especially, it was probably the best way to actually show it was this giraffe business. Hold on a second. Okay. So, here we have a giraffe that's just essentially eating the shrubbery at that height. And here's another one that goes to the top leaves because these get all eaten early on. And so it gets a slightly longer neck, right? Okay. And because it's been used like that, here's our longer neck, right? And that this can actually be passed down to offspring. So we have a kind of a short giraffe neck and a long giraffe neck. Okay, that's one idea of how evolution happened. And so there were, in fact, you could inherit these traits. Okay, so, and there were other thoughts about it too, because by this time, this was the natural history boom especially in Europe and Great Britain. There are people going all over the globe exploring, finding new animals, plants, all that kind of stuff. And people could see that there were things that looked similar to each other, but weren't exactly, or they found things like bones that looked similar to a modern animal, but are different. Okay. And then there's this guy, Charles Lyell, who was a geologist, and at that time, in Great Britain, at Oxford and Cambridge, it was thought they were pretty much all Anglicans, and they thought God made a perfect world. And of course, Lyell showed that, in fact, the world had changed quite a bit over time. That mountains had risen up, volcanoes, all sorts of different layers of sediment that had been laid down over long periods of time. And he also proposed that the same things that were happening now used to happen in the past. The same sorts of how fossils are made, how you get all these sediments. The same things, he wrote a whole chapter basically on adapting animals and plants, adapting to their environments. He didn't say, well, what he predicted, of course, was that if you're in the desert, you're going to have the same kinds of animals, let's say, whether it's in a desert in Africa, a desert in the United States, a desert in Australia. Okay. Depending on what the environment was, you're going to see the same sorts of organisms. So, now, that's where we were, and Charles Lyell was a big kind of a mentor. Oh, Lamarckian evolution, yeah. So remember, Lamarckian evolution is acquiring a trait from use that you pass down to your offspring, and of course, here we have Joan. What's her name? Joan. Yeah, and her daughter Melissa, and basically Rivers. Yeah. So Rivers and her daughter looked similarly, uncannily unnatural. It was never clear whether Melissa's face was a surgical homage, like she did it for her mother, or proof that Lamarck's theory about the inheritance of acquired characteristics was correct. In other words, this is the old giraffe thing, but with surgery. Okay. So, hold on, let's. Okay, good. So, along came Darwin, and later Wallace. And they independently proposed the theory of evolution by natural selection. In fact, Wallace was younger than Darwin, and so came along a little later. And so Darwin was really the first one to propose it, but Wallace independently proposed the same sort of mechanism. And they both took these long trips. Let's see. I think the blue, let's see. Okay. And then, okay, right. So the green is Darwin's kind of circumnavigation of the world, right? Where he finally came back. And then Wallace, later on, about 20 years later, went first to South America and then spent all his time in Southeast Asia. And they both saw similar things. So here's Darwin on the Beagle. And this is the Beagle's voyage from 1831 to 36. He was the naturalist on board. So most of these explorations that were going on from Great Britain and the rest of Europe They were off to do certain things, maybe acquire land, but they always had a naturalist on board. And then Wallace, Darwin was highborn. He was a man of leisure. He inherited a lot of money, and he didn't have to work. Mr. Wallace didn't have that benefit, so he went off and was a great naturalist and collected all over the world. And he's what's called the father of biogeography, why we see certain organisms in certain places. And essentially, it's an explanation in which things are there because they were there, their ancestors were there previously. And so there's descent from a common ancestor. Okay. So here were the kind of different explanations for biodiversity. In other words, all the organisms in the world today and in the world in the past. One of them was that it was special creation. So, in other words, each of these organisms God made independently of each other, and they were all made perfectly. Now, another was this idea of God made lineages independently, but then they could transform, kind of like Lamarckian evolution. Okay, they could transform. Okay, so they start out with a giraffe with a short neck and then move to a giraffe with a long neck. Okay, and then of course, here we have evolution, and basically it shows here's time in the past, a common ancestor that then splits into two different lineages. Okay, and then splits again and again and again. Okay, so this is the one that we know now is essentially true. Okay, is evolution, where you have everything is descended from a common ancestor, including the fact that we share a common ancestor with all sorts of different things. In the end, we share a common ancestor with bacteria. Okay? Now, you might say, well, we don't look like bacteria. Does anybody in here look like bacteria? Oh, that's right. You got him. Right. Exactly. He looks like bacteria. And he's lethal, so don't mess with him. Okay. Now, it turns out that we know this because all organisms that are on the planet share the same exact genetic code, which we'll be learning about. The only way that you could have had such a thing is if we had an initial sort of life form that used DNA as the information for creating organisms. Okay, so that's kind of the evidence. In other words, all this DNA sort of, it could have been any other, let's say, molecule that replicates, passes on the information to the next generation, right? But it turns out it was DNA, and therefore we all, everything from bacteria to humans to anything else that's alive or ever lived, uses DNA as the molecule for inheritance. So, what is evolution? Okay. Simple. It's all about sex and death. That's it. The idea is you want to have as much sex as possible before you die. Okay? In other words, now we have someone in here, right, who has kids? Yes or no? No. Okay. Thought we did maybe for the class. So, no one in here has kids, right? Okay, so you all have no evolutionary fitness. You don't have any offspring. So the kind of thing is that you want to have as much sex. Now I'm counting on you that by the end of this semester, and I want you guys to look around and decide who you want to have sex with, I want to see pregnancy and evolutionary fitness by the time the semester is over. Okay? So just look around, you know, oh, that's good. Yeah, I like her, I like him, whatever. Get together. It's all okay. Oh, sorry. Didn't mean to make you run away. And also, you can also, if you really want, but I have to know about it, you can go to other classrooms and have sex with people in other classrooms as well. I just want to see babies. Okay? And I want to do this before you die. Right? So, if in fact you're a bad boy and you go on and you get someone else mad at you, but you still have lots of babies and then some boyfriend of the girl that you shouldn't have kills you, that's still good because you've left a lot of offspring, no matter what. Right? Okay. It's actually kind of funny. Evolutionary biology shares a lot with religion. Think about religions from the Middle East, whether it's Christianity, Judaism, Islam, whatever it is, it's pretty much all about sex and death. They're pretty much obsessed with sex, like evolutionary biologists are, and they're obsessed and terrified of death, and so they come up with these ideas about transcending death, right? The only difference between evolutionary biology and religion is that they live it and we unfortunately just study it. So I want you guys to actually live it. I'm not telling you to go and get religious or anything, but live it. Okay. That's really all, that's it. That's all about it. That's all the thing that evolution is about. So, any other ideas about what evolution might be about? Oh, you shouldn't look at that. Okay. First of all, we can say that perhaps organisms change over time. Okay? Change in traits or genetic characteristics, allele frequencies, right? So let's say we have two different alleles, one for blue eyes, one for brown eyes. And there's selection, strong selection for blue eyes because we're in the northern climes and blue eyes do better than brown eyes. And so over time you'd expect the frequency of blue eyes to increase. Okay? And then change in heritable information within the population. In other words, the stuff that is inherited has to be heritable, or you won't get change from one generation to the next. We'll look at that in a little second, why that is. So, here's a couple of definitions. Descent with modification. Say descent from what? From a common ancestor. What's the cause of this modification? In other words, what's the mechanism behind it? One of the mechanisms is natural selection, evolution by natural selection. Are there other causes of evolutionary change? Well, not everything has sex, by the way. Sex, when I talk about sex and death, well, there's a lot of things that are asexual, so they don't get to have the fun of having sex. They just have the fun of creating copies of themselves. It doesn't seem very fun, like sex does, but that's besides the point. The question is, are you identical to your parents? No. Anybody in here look like their parents? Okay? How about anybody who doesn't look like one of their parents? Anybody? Anybody who looks like their sister and brother or who doesn't look like a sister and brother? Oh, come on, there we go, okay. So, Now you don't look, most people look like their parents to usually one parent than the other. Remember we talked about chromosomes, and we inherit one from mom, one from pop. Okay? So we get these characteristics from our parents. And now we don't, because of this half and half, we're not identical to to our parents. If we were like bacteria, where there was just one chromosome, not a double chromosome, we'd look identical. We'd have to be clones of our parents, but we're not clones of our parents. We're half related, as it turns out. A clone is 100% related. We're 50% related to our parents, and we're also 50% related to our brothers and sisters, and we're 1/8 related to our cousins. We're not going to get into why that is so, but essentially it's because half and half and half. So, now, some of you, of course, might think, okay, you're not really, why is it that you and, let's say, your brother look a lot different? And you look at your parents, and one of your parents is kind of dark olive skin and dark hair, and the other one is similar to that, and yet your brother has blonde hair. How did that happen? Any ideas? Huh? Adopted? Okay, that's one possibility. Kind of along that same line, it could have been the milkman. Right? Okay, it happens all the time. In fact, if you actually did a genetic test on all the children that are, let's say, in this country, you'd find that maybe about, 10% have different fathers. Salute. Okay. So, could have been the milkman. But this is why we look kind of like our parents, but not exactly. Oh, and here's a question. Is evolution restricted only to biological organisms? Huh? Did I hear a no or a yes? Huh? Okay, what do you think? Okay. Is evolution only found in living things? No. Okay, give me an example why it's not. Anybody back here? Someone said. What did you say? Okay. Okay, so, is evolution just with living things? What do you think?
Like with plants and like flowers, how sometimes you can like cross different flowers and you get them mixed up.
Yeah, but that's still a living thing, right? Okay, so there's an example, yes. Technology. Oh my God. These guys, yes. Okay. Well, think about it. Do cars evolve? Right? Don't they? We started out with these little things with little funny engines on them. Now we have these car companies, they make certain kinds of cars. They resemble perhaps cars from the past that they had made before. They make some modifications. They find ways to make things work a little bit better. One of the reasons perhaps why you buy a car is because it goes really fast. Right? Like a Lamborghini. Others of you buy a car because it gets good gas mileage. Another one, you buy a car because it's reliable, it doesn't break down. You're actually selecting which car you want based on the characteristics it has. Right? Oh, another reason, of course, is the price. So, if someone really likes cars that go fast, there's going to be more of those cars being sold in the future and more of those cars on the highway. The same thing goes with cars that get good gas mileage. The same thing that goes on with all of technology. If you look and you see where our technology came from, mostly it came from what happened in the past. So, a lot of our computer stuff, a lot of it is based on Einstein's special theory of relativity and the photoelectric effect that he proposed in 1905. That's the basic science, and then someone found out how to use that to give us kind of modern electronics. Okay? Those ideas evolved. They were passed down from one person to the next. Now, unlike biological populations, where the information is passed down from one generation to the next, ideas and the creation of those ideas, whether they're automobiles or cell phones or whatever, or just the ideas themselves, they can be passed not only down to your offspring, you raise them a certain way, but they can be passed along to your friends, and you read something in, let's say, a good example is the anti-vaccination group. This is an example of cultural evolution gone amiss. We know that vaccines protect people. We've known about this for a very long time, before there was even an idea of the germ theory of disease. But they came along, someone came up with that idea, well, there's some idiot who wasn't a very good researcher, said, oh, vaccines cause autism. Someone picked it up and ran with it, and it was started to spread by the internet, by telling each other's friends, and all of a sudden there were a lot of people out there who suddenly have a phenotype of believing that vaccines cause autism. Doesn't turn out to be true. So that's cultural evolution. So we have all these ideas, some of which we got from our parents, that we were taught, others that we got from ideas around us. Okay. So, we'll get back to this slide in a second. So, evolution by natural selection was first proposed by Darwin and then Wallace, as I mentioned before. Species were not especially created, but were descended from earlier species. Species change over time. Individuals vary, providing the source for populations to change over time. So individuals do not change over time. I'm born with what I have, even if I do all the weightlifting, right? Get really big and muscular, I still can't pass that on to my offspring. But if that is good for, if I have those big muscles, and that is beneficial, then that trait will spread in the population and become more frequent. And so, populations change over time, individuals do not. This is an important idea. Individuals do not evolve. Populations of individuals do. It can be populations actually of, let's say, cells. It can be populations of DNA. For now, we're just going to talk about populations of organisms, whether it's a plant, let's say a redwood tree, or it's an animal, a giraffe, whatever it is. Individuals do not change, but the population changes in terms of what traits are actually favored. So if you're in an environment where being tall is favored, you would expect over time that population, the individuals in it, the ones that were taller, would leave more offspring. Okay. So there were two great ideas by Darwin and Wallace. The first was evolution by natural selection, which we're going to get into right now. And the second was descent from a common ancestor. In other words, you have a common ancestor, and you and your siblings in having parents that you share. Either full siblings where you have both the same parents, or you have one parent you share with one father or mother and one with the other. Okay? So, you're descended, in a sense. You've inherited their traits, kind of mixed up, so that they're your common ancestor. If you go back again, another generation, it's your grandparents. You have 4 of them, right? Well, the same thing happens with species. You start with a species that somehow the populations get split, and they evolve separately over time, but they share a most recent common ancestor. So, descent from a common ancestor is actually a pattern, and it's caused by the fact that you inherit similar traits, similar alleles. Evolution by natural selection is a process where some individuals with certain traits survive and reproduce and leave more offspring. That's why I told you guys all to get with it and have lots of offspring. And those with traits that are beneficial will make up a larger share of the future generations. So in Origin of the Species, this is the last paragraph that Darwin wrote in the book. Well, let's read it. There is grandeur in this view of life, with its several powers having been originally breathed into a few forms or into one, and that, whilst this planet has gone cycling around and round on so simple a beginning, on and on according to the fixed law of gravity, from which so simple a beginning endless forms most beautiful and most wonderful have been and are being evolved. So, he's even kind of a poet. It's kind of an amazing view, though, if you think about all the diversity around how it all happened, and how life actually evolved into all these wonderful different forms. So, the essence of the process of evolution, essentially by natural selection, is that new variants of a gene, let's say new alleles, so these are from mutations, in other words, mutations in the genome, enter, so these are alleles, a population, and if they're favored, they increase in frequency. If they're not, they never get into the population in a very large frequency before they go away. And old allelic or variants, if they're not as good as the new ones, go away as well and are replaced by the new ones. So, essentially, allele frequencies or variants in a gene fluctuate or change in a population depending on if certain alleles give a benefit to the organism versus an allele that, let's say, gives less of a benefit. So, we might have a population of wolves, and let's say there's global warming, and where wolves are in upper Canada, let's say the boreal forest is really cold, but it warms up, and having really, really thick, long fur is no longer favored, because you're not dealing with cold temperatures anymore, you're dealing with warmer ones. So individuals that have less dense fur are favored because otherwise they're running around like having a big coat in a desert in a hot environment, they get overheated. So those with less dense coats, increase in the population. If the weather was to get colder, the climate was to get colder, the same thing would happen except in the other direction. Now, as we can see, coat density, there's no one perfect coat density. In some environments, a heavier coat is favored. In other environments, warmer environments, a less dense coat, fur, is favored. Okay. And let's go over again what we're kind of talking about. We remember what an allele was. Anybody in here remember what an allele was? Just talk about it. Huh? Anybody? Okay.
Right.
Huh?
One of the two versions of the gene.
One of possibly many versions of a gene. Whereas, since we're diploid, we can have up to two, but otherwise, right. Okay, so an allele is a different version of a gene. A gene pool, in other words, then, is all the different variants or alleles that are found in a population. So here we have, we start with this side of things. We've got these adult chickens. Okay, these are the gametes, and each one might have a different allele. One might be for orange, one might be for blue, right? One might be for green. I don't see any greens in here, but okay. Oh, blue and yellow, right? We end up with green. Okay, and so we see in the future generation, then of course, in this gene pool, okay, so these are all the alleles, all the different variants in one big pool, and then in the future generation, we end up with all these that have been perhaps replicated. Oops. So we have a population, we have variants, and we have a gene pool. Okay, and we're going to stop right here.